following recording contains excerpts from an interview conducted with a board member of TSMC in Mike Splinter. Mr. Splinter joined the board in June of 2015 following his previous stint as CEO of Applied Materials. Aside from Mr. Splinter's direct involvement on the board, he has played a significant role in TSMC for the past 25 years. First, in the 90s and early 2000s, as head of manufacturing for Intel, Mr. Splinter used TSMC for manufacturing purposes. Through this relationship, he became close friends with the founder and former CEO of TSMC, Morris Chang. This friendship proved influential as Mr. Splinter headed Applied Materials, where TSMC was and currently is one of their top customers, accounting for over $1 billion in revenue per year. In actuality, the interview lasted 50 minutes, but has been trimmed to the most interesting portions. I thoroughly enjoyed talking to Mr. Splinter and hope this somewhat disjointed assembly of his thoughts reveals at least some insight into TSMC.
The first question is really, what is the relationship between TSMC and the Taiwanese government? Is it a one of support, one of opposition, or one of neutrality, especially as you guys look to expand overseas with the investment into Arizona and similar plants like that?
Yeah, I think, if you take a look at it over the last, let's say, 10 years, through both parties being in power in Taiwan, the relationship has been very, very good. TSMC is largely an apolitical organization, even though maybe Morris was more KMT leaning than the two big parties in Taiwan are KMT and DPP, and the President Tsai is a DPP candidate or member. So the relationships are very, very good. The government certainly understands that TSMC is the biggest company in Taiwan. It's the most profitable company in Taiwan. It's 20% of TAIEX exchange market, total. When you sum up all the companies on the Taipei Stock Exchange, TSMC represents 20% of that. So either party has no choice but to work very, very closely with TSMC. They employ 50,000 engineers and are all over the country. Now, that being said, it's difficult in Taiwan for TSMC because of limitations on land, power, water, which each one of these factories use a huge amount. And that puts stress on the government, but they've been able to supply that. And it's been very, very positive relationship. Now,
of the resistors, or what varies from the Huawei chip versus the Apple chip, if they're all the same, nanometer, if they're all the same?
So TSMC just provides the process, right? Okay. So they they have developed a process. Now, a process might today take 2,000 steps. There might be 2,000 process steps to get through the process. So it's very, very complicated. Mm-hmm. It's very, very technical. But the difference between Apple, microprocessors or applications processors from Huawei, Apple, and Intel, the architecture of the design might be different. Give you an example. So if you're going to multiply two numbers together, so 2 times 2, there's one way to approach that. And if you have a fast enough processor, you just do the multiplication in binary, right? Another way is to say, I know the answer to 2 plus 2, so I'm going to store it in the memory. So all I have to do when you write 2 plus 2 is I go to the memory and get the answer. The memory is actually on the chip, but you route to the memory. And so these are just an example of there's a very obviously very, very basic example of two different approaches to how you do computing.
Is there any momentum or anything like that to have a TSMC foundry or anything in mainland China, or would that violate?
Yeah,
You know,
sure.
what
There's,
that
well, I mean,
exists?
TSMC has a factory in China. The Chinese government is trying very, very, very hard to create a semiconductor industry. They have modest success in the memory business, almost zero success in the foundry, kind of logic foundry business.
Yeah.
Business.
Yeah. So why when I was researching it, I became curious, you know, in a terrible way. Why doesn't China just take over? You know, if this is semiconductor industry is one of the most important industries in the world, and you more or less have ownership over TSMC over Taiwan, is the only thing stopping them from, you know, annexing Taiwan, for lack of a better term, just relationships with the US, or is there something else why they're opting not to take full control of that?
Well, I think Taiwan's more important than Hong Kong. They really botched Hong Kong. So I would not say just US, the world sentiment is quite negative on China's imperialism. You know, they go around talking about they're developing an innovative culture and all this kind of stuff, but the reality is quite different than the rhetoric. So,
Yeah, just while the connection is
but could
stable.
they? But could they? And are they doing nasty stuff every day? Are they flying planes every day into Taiwanese airspace? They are. And is there a potential for somebody to make a mistake? There's potential for somebody to make a mistake here, and that potential is increasing, and that's not good.
If it was a movement by China, and there's a public response by the Taiwanese population, what amount of impact do you think that would have just on TSMC operations?
Well, depends how bad it is. So could be very, very severe. I mean, you know, all the men under under 30 would be immediately conscripted into the Taiwanese army if it lasts more than 24 hours.
Oh
But
yeah,
I'm not sure.
I didn't even think about that. Yeah, I don't know how well they would fare in that regard, but yeah, I didn't even think
Well,
about that.
we sell them a lot of military equipment, and it's why the Taiwanese right now are so desperate to close a few military contracts with the U.S. before the change in administration.
This, that I mean, obviously the ban on Huawei. I saw recently that it's somewhat lessening, and developments are happening there. What is going to be the supplier for Huawei's, you know, chip need, whatever chip, whether it's 5 or 3 or whatever it was? They don't know.
Nobody.
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 There's just no Huawei phones, or, you know, they're just going into whatever stockpile they have. They won't use. So I think you mentioned SMIC. Are they even close to developing what Huawei
They're
needs?
4 to 5 generations behind.
Hmm.
In 2004, they were 4 generations behind. They've lost ground in the last 15 years.
So how is China dealing with that? What is Huawei doing?
I don't know. They're using their stockpile right now. The U.S. is not going to give anybody a license to help them on 5G. They're just not. I just don't see that happening. They'll give them licenses maybe for 4G phones or for other products that Huawei makes. But I think the target is all around 5G phones. They're just not going to 5G phones, 5G base stations, all the infrastructure, computing infrastructure you need to develop 5G, real 5G. I mean, initial rollouts are not what 5G is going to be like 2 years from now. So
would Samsung or any, you know,
they cannot.
non-US? Samsung can't.
they have U.S. equipment in their factory. The
Oh,
way the rule works is all about, controlling Applied Materials, Lam, KLA, these companies, and the Japanese companies too, because and the European companies, because we have this thing called the Wassenaar Agreement with other countries, and everybody agrees to abide by the same rules. But
what is the Wassenaar Agreement?
you can look it up, but
Okay.
basically it's a deemed to export kind of rule that if this is a deemed technology export, the governments can make rules around them. Basically, U.S. government can make rules and everybody will follow. Um, so applied material, if Samsung uses Applied Materials equipment,
Mm-hmm.
they cannot sell to Huawei.
Huh.
So there is no factory in the world that doesn't use Applied Materials equipment.
Yeah.
So nobody
So
can sell to Huawei, not even SMIC.
So let's say the Huawei stockpiles are running out. What is that? I don't imagine, is that motive enough for China to go to Taiwan and not go to Taiwan, but demand that this is fixed, or do they just let Huawei kind of peter out?
I think there will be serious discussions late next year, but I don't think it will be early on. I might be surprised.
Interesting.
But I don't think I don't think I don't think big easing will happen very quickly. The SMIC thing is different. SMIC also has some sanctions on them. I think those have a better chance to be lifted than Huawei. Philosophy.
Do you see far down the line, there comes a point where Amazon or Apple, any of the big clients, decide to move away from using TSMC, using the like pure play foundry model and develop everying in house, or even 50 years down, it's just not
50
worth it
years, no chance.
economically, no chance.
Well, it might be worth it economically. Some finance guy could make a spreadsheet that makes it look like it is, but it's impossible. Because if you look at the semiconductor industry over the last 25 or 30 years, there used to be 100 people who made their own processor, maybe more than that, 100 different companies that made their own integrated circuits, processed their own integrated circuits. That number is dramatically down. Today, there's only 3 companies on the leading edge, Intel, Samsung, and TSMC, with TSMC leading. Now, could Samsung take the lead from TSMC over time? Sure, TSMC took the lead from Intel, so could these things change over time? But fundamentally, the foundry model is, so, think about this business model. If I'm a single supplier and I have to buy all this manufacturing equipment, now there's 100 of these guys, everybody buys manufacturing equipment. It's quite inefficient. Factories are not fully loaded during lull periods. They're overloaded during boom periods, or that might even be seasonal periods. So the industry is very inefficient. If you get it down to a small number of players where you get huge economy of scale, and you get a huge economy of know-how, which is even more important than probably the economy of scale, it's hard to beat. The foundry model is a hard model to beat.
Like if you had to say, level of worry you generally have for, the sake of TSMC operating, plus or minus between 15% of what it's at currently over the next 10 years in regards to China's influence, would you say that there's concern, or do you say that it's more of it's a consideration but not a real threat?
I think it's a consideration and a real threat, but there's not a lot any business group can do about it. I mean, part of the reason I am chairman of the U.S. Taiwan Business Council is just to have more knowledge about what's going on politically and to keep an eye on it. So we have a way to assess quickly what we need to do. But, you know, the problem for TSMC is so much of their infrastructure is in Taiwan. There's, you know, nothing they could do in a short to medium term to mitigate a Chinese takeover of Taiwan.
Yeah. Can you just give a brief summary of TSMC's role in the Apple global supply chain?
TSMC is more important to Apple than Apple is to Apple.
With that last clip, that is the conclusion of the supercut version of this interview. Mr. Listinger, I hope you learned something at least about TSMC from Mr. Splinter's discussion. And I just want to say that I'm incredibly thankful for you allowing me the opportunity to research a subject that I generally have been interested in for the past 2 or 3 years. I hope you have a wonderful Thanksgiving, and I hope to see you and the rest of the family next semester. Thank you again.